Daniel Burros was born March 5th, 1937, in the Lebanon Hospital in the Bronx, New York, to parents George and Esther Burros. Both of Dan's grandfathers were rabbi immigrants from Russia. Soon after he was born, his family would move to Queens, New York, where young Dan would attend the Talmud Torah in Richmond Hill. Dan was a very calm, focused, and highly intelligent child. Most of the kids at the Talmud Torah would do the bare minimum to get by, or just leave altogether. But Dan would excel. He was Rabbi Appleman's favorite of all the kids. Dan's half Torah was the only one Rabbi Appleman would keep of all the kids because it was so neat and well done. Appleman believed Dan's brilliance would allow him to do great things in the world when he grew up. Keeping Dan's book was a testament to that. Dan's bar mitzvah would be held at the Talmud Torah in 1950. A quote from the book, One More Victim.
On the day of the bar mitzvah, Dan's mother and father came, and so did other relatives, and the rabbi was proud. Dan read beautifully, and afterward there was cake and wine for everybody, brought by Mrs. Burros. There was no big bar mitzvah party, no huge catered affair that American Jews with money love to give. But the next day the rabbi and his wife were invited to Dan's home for a little spread cold cuts and soda, and Dan greeted them like a king and queen. There was more life in his face than they had seen before, and laughed and talked a lot. George Burroughs, quiet as usual, said little more than hello to the rabbi and his wife.
Dan's bar mitzvah was the highlight for the rabbis and the elders at the Talmud Torah. Dan would stick around with a burning desire to learn more, attending Talmud studies and doing Israeli song and dance classes. Around 8 months after his bar mitzvah, Rabbi Appleman would leave the Talmud Torah. He would go to Long Island where he could lead a larger congregation. Rabbi Appleman believed Dan's love for Judaism was in part to the affection that he showed him in being his guidance. So when he left the Talmud Torah, Dan took this as a personal betrayal. Dan would attend Public School 100. He was well-mannered, never late, and near a straight-A student. The parents of Dan's school friend would recall him as being obedient, polite, and never gave his mother a hard time. Dan was achieving well above his grade level, and he would transfer to PS 121 for 7th and 8th grade, where he averaged over 90% in every class. He never got in trouble, and his teachers recalled him as an all-around good kid. Even at a young age, Dan had an all-or-nothing mentality. He'd give 100% to be the best. A friend of Dan's that he used to play chess with would recall how intense Dan would be playing chess. Win or lose, he would break a sweat trying to find the best moves in every game they played. During a shop class, the students were assigned a project to make a model boat. All of the students would make a boat around 2 feet long, but Dan always had to do more. He had to make a 4-foot boat. He always had to show everyone that he could do better than them, even if it wasn't required. At the school, they had a dance class. Typically, the boys had little to no interest in this. But Dan, he had to prove he could do it. Dan studied this hard and practiced even harder. And when the teachers told the students to pair up, nobody did, except Dan. He grabbed the hand of one of the girls and they did a dance in front of everyone. In 1954, Dan would attend John Adams High School, and his brilliance would again shine through. The school admittance test would show his IQ to be around 135, and he had never scored a grade lower than 85. While at John Adams, Dan started to become more aggressive. Despite his tiny stature, he would pick a fight with the biggest kid he could find outside. A group of students would gather around to watch the fight. Dan would be beaten bloody and solidly defeated. But to him, this didn't matter. The following day, he would tell a friend, "So what if I lost?" Winning or losing didn't matter to him. He wanted everyone to know that he wasn't scared, and he would go toe-to-toe with anyone. This began an almost addiction to fighting. Dan would fight nearly every day after that, slowly becoming more and more unhinged. One day, Dan would get in a fight over baseball teams. Dan would get his teeth knocked out. He would tackle the boy he was fighting and began screaming, "I'm gonna kill you." The kids around him during this time described him as up or down, wonderful or terrible. There was no maintaining a normal middle ground anymore. Dan needed discipline, and his father was a military veteran, and he always admired the military. He started hanging out with a kid named Lloyd. Lloyd was a bright kid working on becoming an engineer. Lloyd loved National Socialist German military generals. He had photos of Rommel, German planes, and tanks. And Lloyd often spoke about the injustice done to Germany by the Allies in World War II. And this would start Dan's interest in the National Socialist military too. He started collecting photos, memorabilia, and drawing pictures of Nazi Germany. At the time, Dan didn't care about the politics of World War II. He just believed Germany had the best military. He admired the generals, their tactics, and the machinery they built. Dan had a teacher at the high school who would warn about the Red Menace and the dangers of communism. At first, he didn't think anything of it, but as time passed, he started thinking more and more about this Red Menace. At the time, Senator Joe McCarthy was warning about the communist infiltration of the United States.
One communist on the faculty of one university is one communist too many. One communist among the American advisors at Yalta was one communist too many. And even if there were only one communist in the State Department, even if there were only one communist in the State Department, that would still be one communist too many.
And Dan began seeing the world through an anti-communist lens. Couple this with his admiration for the German military. He started gaining sympathy for the National Socialists. One day, Lloyd and another boy got into a fight. As Lloyd backed the boy into a corner, Dan would scream, "Jew bastard," and the fight stopped. Everyone looked around and walked away silently. Dan started taking a hard pro-National Socialist stance after this, often getting into shouting matches with the other students. During this time, Dan would join the United States National Guard, something he would be very proud of, wearing his uniform every chance he got, even to school. This got him the nickname Soldier Boy and the General, which many used to mock him. While he was in the National Guard, he began telling everybody at school how he's going to go to West Point when he graduated. For this, Dan would be mocked and made fun of. Some of the students would laugh at the quote, Jew boy going to West Point, mocking him so much to the point that it would send Dan home in tears. But he'd be right back the next day telling everybody he was going to West Point. His grades began to plunder in his Hebrew class. He just couldn't, quote, wrap his tongue around it. He would get a 70 on the Hebrew test. The next time he'd do a little better, getting a 75. But he would ultimately fail with a grade of 57. He now hated Hebrew, and he made sure everyone around him knew it. He would switch to German classes, where he'd maintain an average of around 90%. Dan would ultimately graduate with honors, and despite his mother's wishes, he wouldn't even make an attempt at college. He would go straight to the army. Dan would tell everyone that he applied to West Point, and he was denied due to his poor vision. No records show that he ever even applied to West Point, but he would maintain that he did. Instead, in 1955, he'd enlist in the army. The army is where his mental instability would really break through. He would be mocked relentlessly for doing everything too perfect, trying too hard, and his physical abilities. Dan was assigned to the 187th Army Airborne, where he recorded 17 jumps as a paratrooper. Dan would make multiple suicide attempts while in the army. One of his suicide notes read as follows:
I've swallowed 20 aspirin tablets. I consider this a fatal dose. I'm taking my life as I have nothing to live for. I'd hoped to see the revival of National Socialism. I see now our case is hopeless. We can easily deceive the decadent democracies, but the Soviets are the new Herrenvolk. Now that there is no more chance for the NSDAP, I no longer have a motive for saving the forces of the decadent democracies. To them, I will eternal damnation. I go to my Führer Hitler der Grosse in the Third Reich that endures forever. Sieg Heil, Heil Hitler.
The Army would give Dan a mental evaluation. Captain Carl B. Schaefer, the medical corps psychologist, would write a recommendation on Dan that says the following.
It is recommended that no further attempt at rehabilitation of this soldier be made, since it is believed that he is useless to the service, and further such attempts should be of no avail. This soldier should be placed before a board of officers with a view to separation from the service under the provisions of Article 635-209 because of unsuitability.
Dan would also refuse orders to defend black students integrating into a school in Little Rock, Arkansas.
In the present case, the troops are there pursuant to law, solely for the purpose of preventing interference with the orders of the court.
On September 25, 1957, the 101st Airborne Division and 10,000 National Guard troops escorted the Little Rock Nine as they walked bravely past screaming mobs and made their way.
This, coupled with his suicide attempts, he would be discharged from the Army under honorable conditions by reasons of unsuitability, character, and behavior disorder. Dan would return home to his parents' house after being discharged from the military. He would get a job at a local library where he'd be in charge of printing. He got a reputation of being an odd person, a hard worker, but also a Nazi. As every day on his lunch hour, he would draw a Nazi soldier with gear and decorative swastikas. Despite the content, his coworkers thought his art was good, and they tasked him with drawing the office background for Christmas. During this time, Dan talked to his coworkers almost exclusively about Jews, Hitler, and World War II. When anyone would question his beliefs, he'd return with papers, books, and lectures about how he was right. Every weekend, Dan would search New York City far and wide for Nazi memorabilia. One day he found Hitler's party badge, which he ecstatically purchased for $5. He had to hide it away with his collection, as his mother would throw it away if she had found them, like she did with other things that had came in the mail for him. To bypass this, he had to rent a P.O. box that she had no access to. Dan would leave his job at the library when his boss asked him to print something a specific way. He said he absolutely would not do it that way. He walked out and never returned. Soon after, Dan would get a job at a shipping company. But word had gotten around to the New York City police about Dan's open devotion to National Socialism, and they would hand it off to a special branch that monitors political extremists. Dan would start the American Nationalist Socialist Party, in which he began printing and sending out flyers from his P.O. box with custom swastika stamps. The party consisted of himself. From here, he began contacting other Nazi groups in the country and began relationships through the mail. That was about as far as it went during this time. But Dan was becoming more obsessed. In his wallet, he carried around many Nazi photos and a photo of Colonel Hans Ulrich Rudel in a reproduction letter that Rudel had sent him. Colonel Baumler was also in contact with Dan, seeking his help in publishing a manuscript in which Burros would comply, writing publishers for him in an effort to get it published. One of the letters to the publisher says the following.
Dear Mr. Cerf, I am writing to you on behalf of an acquaintance of mine, a retired German colonel, retired. He wishes to have his book published in America. It is entitled Monte Cassino, and is naturally about the Battle of Monte Cassino in the Second World War. The author commanded a German parachute regiment in the battle. The book has already been published in Germany by E.S. Mittler and Sohn, Frankfurt, Maine, and a motion picture was made from the book in Germany. I feel this book has great possibilities of success in America. The book would certainly be of interest to the many Americans who served in the Italian theater of operations. I think at this time many people would be interested in reading the German side or version of the battle, especially when written by a parachute officer. This book would also be of interest to many Roman Catholics because it concerns a Catholic monastery. I have no experience in the line of representing authors, and I am only representing Colonel Baumler as a favor to an officer I admire. He asked me to put out feelers to American publishers. I write first to you because I liked your personality on television, and I thought you might be the one to handle this. If your firm is interested, I will bring over a copy of the book, as published in Germany, of course, and the rest of the negotiations can be carried out with the firm of Mittler and Sohn, etc., in Germany. If Random House does not handle this sort of translation, perhaps you can recommend another publisher. I send a stamped, self-addressed envelope for your reply. Thank you very much for your time. Sincerely yours, Dan Burros.
Dan would receive a letter back, politely declining his offer, citing that a book had already recently been published on the same topic, and they weren't interested. He'd then receive another letter from a German paratrooper by the name Joseph H. Maguera, who had been dropped into Poland with the idea of restarting the German-American Bund. Dan was extremely interested, and he would reply to the letter, but he'd never receive a reply back. The reasons for this are still unknown. Dan started gaining a deep interest for Nordic paganism, and he started despising Christianity along with Judaism. He began correspondence with many different groups and individuals. One of the letters he would say,
I thank you so much for your letter. I agree with you that Christianity was a great disaster for the Nordic. This doctrine is alien and to him, and destructive to his nature. I myself am a bitter enemy of this doctrine of weakness, for that is what it is. I would like very much if you could sometime give me what your husband thinks a good program for a Nordic party would be. I would like his detailed political views. I have very great respect for his views, and I think I could learn a great deal from him. I have, of course, my own ideas, but I am still young, and still can learn a lot. Only a fool is not anxious to learn. I admire Hitler very much, but one of his faults was he wasn't willing to listen to others.
around this time, possibly believing that he could be found out, he began using the name Hans Friedrich Borchers, which he took from the book Undercover by John Roy Carlson. Dan's P.O. box started being flooded with anti-Nazi letters, hate mail, and the police were monitoring every letter in and out. But none of this mattered to him at all. He didn't care. In the 1960s, Dan joined the National Renaissance Party, founded by James Madole. He would work his way up to commander of the security echelon. Little is known about his time with the National Renaissance Party. Dan had been hearing about a man named George Lincoln Rockwell and the start of the American Nazi Party. He would drop all the plans of his American Nationalist Socialist Party that he created in New York and immediately went to Arlington, Virginia in 1960 to join Rockwell. He quickly racked up a reputation around the party for his brilliance, his radical ideas, and his willingness to fight. Dan had found exactly what he was looking for, a structured, disciplined revival of National Socialism. For months, Dan would be a stormtrooper. Stormtroopers were the new members that had to carry out the orders of the official members, where they had to earn their right to become a full-fledged member.
What's the difference? The Stormtrooper organization is under party discipline, and they are required to act upon command. A member has no obligations to carry out any commands whatsoever other than to be loyal to the party.
What this class tonight is about is a subject that we should all be pretty familiar with, and that is National Socialism. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you some questions about National Socialism, and I want you to each write a little essay on these questions.
New members must serve a 90-day period as probationary troopers, during which they are tested on their knowledge of Nazi goals and methods. At the end of this time, they are admitted as stormtroopers.
Dan was making trips back and forth from New York to Arlington while participating in Nazi Party activities, pickets, protests, speeches. During these months as a stormtrooper, Dan racked up 4 arrests and a bunch of tickets. His biggest legal issue at the time was a $100 fine and a 6-month suspended sentence when the American Nazi Party picketed the Anti-Defamation League. Dan would get a job at the DC Chamber of Commerce despite listing 3 Nazi Party members as his references, and public speaking was part of his additional qualifications. He would file the paperwork to become an official American Nazi Party member, listing his real father's name, and he would list his mother's name as Erica Schroeder. He would be accepted into the party where he would take the oath.
In the presence of the great spirit of the universe.
In the presence of the great spirit of the universe.
And my loyal party comrades.
And my loyal party comrades.
I hereby irrevocably pledge.
I hereby irrevocably pledge.
To Adolf Hitler.
To Adolf Hitler,
The philosophical leader.
the philosophical leader
Of the white man's fight.
of the white man's fight
For an idealistic.
for an idealistic
And scientific world order.
and scientific world order
Against the atheistical.
against the atheistical
And materialistic forces.
and materialistic forces
Of Marxism and racial suicide.
of Marxism and racial suicide.
I pledge my reverence and respect.
I pledge my reverence and respect
To the commander.
to the commander
Of Adolf Hitler's National Socialist movement.
of Adolf Hitler's National Socialist movement.
I pledge my faith.
I pledge my faith,
My courage.
my courage,
And my willing obedience.
and my willing obedience
To my party comrades.
to my party comrades
Throughout the world.
throughout the world.
I pledge my absolute loyalty.
I pledge my absolute loyalty,
Even unto death.
even unto death.
To myself.
To myself,
As a leader of the white man's fight.
as a leader of the white man's fight,
I pledge a clean and manly life of honor.
I pledge a clean and manly life of honor.
To the United States of America.
To the United States of America,
I pledge my loyalty.
I pledge my loyalty
And my careful compliance.
and my careful compliance
With its Constitution and laws.
with its Constitution and laws
Until those which are unjust.
until those which are unjust
Can be legally changed.
can be legally changed
By winning the hearts of my people.
by winning the hearts of my people.
To my ignorant fellow white men.
To my ignorant fellow white men
Who will hate and persecute me.
who will hate and persecute me
Because they have been so cruelly brainwashed.
because they have been so cruelly brainwashed,
I pledge my patience and my love.
I pledge my patience and my love.
To the traitors of my race and nation.
To the traitors of my race and nation,
I pledge swift and ruthless justice.
I pledge swift and ruthless justice.
Dan would work his way up and become the party secretary, the third highest position, and he produced many of the party materials, including one of the most important, the Stormtrooper's Manual. Some of the party members had their suspicions about Dan's background and his mental state when he talked about the various methods of torture he wanted to use against Jews and blacks. At some point, Dan would steal his application paper and flee the party. While Dan was going back and forth from New York to Arlington, Virginia, he was active in the KKK. There's many different sources that cite his position in the Klan, from the highest Grand Dragon position to just a ranking member. His position was Kleagle, the fourth highest Klan position, as confirmed by Roy Frankhouser, the Grand Dragon, and FBI documents. Little is known about all of his Klan activities, but he did attend cross burnings and various other ceremonies. They were none the wiser of his Jewish background. In 1963, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, would organize a protest over job discrimination at the White Castle restaurant. Dan and a few of his friends would show up to disrupt the protests. Dan and the others would later be arrested on weapons and firearms charges, where he'd serve 10 days in Sing Sing before his mother posted his $7,500 bail. Dan would return to Arlington, speak with Rockwell, and Rockwell would allow him back in the party. Rockwell saw Dan's brilliance, and despite being unhinged at times, he believed he could keep Dan under control, and he saw him as a value to the party. If they could control his behavior, he was highly intelligent, a hard worker, a talented artist and printer. Dan would be the Nazi Party secretary, the third highest position in the party. Dan was also known in the DC area to stand on the corners handing out flyers, wearing a Lee Harvey Oswald fan club shirt, and he was also found to be in Lee Harvey Oswald's address book. In 1964, the FBI began investigating a publication called The Free American. Only a few issues would be published, but it was well done compared to the other extremist publications at the time. The FBI would be surprised to learn that the entire thing was published and edited solely by Dan Burros. The Free American office was listed as 152 West 42nd Street, Suite 536, New York, New York. Dan would pick up a newspaper that caught his eye because a headline about the Klan stood out to him. He'd be shocked when he'd see his name listed in the column about unmasking the ranking Klansman. A mixture of excitement and fear came over him seeing this. When the panic set in, his mother reads the Journal American every day, plus his job would see it. Dan would buy all the remaining copies from the stand. The House Committee of Un-American Activities had their sights set on him. The New York Times would write an article piggybacking off the Journal American article, and this one would get back to his job and he'd be fired. This started an uncontrollable spiral of events for Dan. The New York Times article would catch the eye of an agent that knew Dan from the years before when Dan was dipping his feet into National Socialism. This agent knew Dan's secret, but he brushed it off years ago. So this agent was shocked to see Dan was now a ranking member in the KKK. Now the agent believed Dan wasn't just some guy dabbling into extremist politics anymore, and believed he was beyond saving. He believed Dan was a true danger to society, and believed it was his moral obligation to expose Dan as being Jewish and get him kicked out of any racist organization that he was part of. He would contact a friend that worked at the New York Times, providing details about Dan, his family, ancestry, and their phone numbers and addresses. The New York Times was ready to jump on this story. They'd assigned John McCandlish Phillips to follow up on the information. Phillips immediately got to work calling around and began to dig up everything on Dan Burros, from childhood, his family tree, his synagogue, school records, and every extremist organization he belonged to. The walls were closing in on Dan, and he didn't even know the full extent of it yet. Phillips had everything he needed for the exposure, but he wanted to confront Dan face to face with all the evidence. Phillips would take the train over to Mr. and Mrs. Burros' house in Queens. He'd ring the bell, but nobody answered. While he waited, he began walking around asking the neighbors if they knew Dan Burros, with mixed results. Some knew, some didn't, some wouldn't reply. One neighbor told Phillips Dan was a good kid. Phillips would keep waiting outside for hours in the rain, until finally George Burros, Dan's father, would walk up carrying groceries. Phillips would tell Mr. Burros what was going on, worked for the New York Times, and he was doing a story about Dan being Jewish. George would give no comment before quickly going inside and locking the door on Phillips. Phillips couldn't find Dan anywhere, so he just kept digging into his past while he was waiting. Phillips would wake up around 5 a.m. to make the train ride from Manhattan to Queens again. A little after 8 a.m., Phillips exited the train, walked out onto Lefferts Boulevard, where by a stroke of luck, he'd spot Dan Burros heading into the barber shop. Had he even been a minute later, he would have completely missed Dan entering the barber shop. He wouldn't miss this opportunity. Phillips quickly caught up with Dan and introduced himself, letting him know he was writing a story about him, but he didn't show his hand. Dan agreed to talk to him where they went to a luncheon and they'd have a civil talk. Dan was still under the assumption that Phillips was only looking for information about the Klan and his affiliation, until Phillips dropped the bomb. He knew all of Dan's history, knew he was Jewish, and had his parents' marriage records to prove it. All Dan could say was, quote, "Gee, fantastic." But they'd continue talking, and Dan would become enraged when he found out Phillips was planning to publish everything. After this, Dan would threaten to kill him and told him it would ruin his life. Phillips would say,
"The whole atmosphere of that luncheonette changed. It was not the place I had walked into. There was blackness in it, blackness crowding around me and perplexity within and fear. All that came with a few short words, but there seemed to be a power of evil in them."
After this meeting, the New York Times would assign Phillips a security detail before he'd head back to Queens to Dan's old synagogue to ask more questions for the story. Dan would leave multiple messages for Phillips and the New York Times saying, quote, "I know I can't stop that story, but I'm going out in a blaze of glory," threatening to, quote, "put on a show at the New York Times offices, even if it meant, quote, catching some lead while doing it." Phillips desperately wanted to get the story published immediately, but the editors needed some more time, and they wouldn't make the deadline to publish it. After the meeting, Dan would head to Reading, Pennsylvania, where he'd stay with fellow Klansman Roy Frankhouser, his girlfriend, at Roy's 133 South 4th Street home. An incident occurred when Dan and Roy walked to the People's Drug Store, and they'd see a group of blacks near the drugstore. Roy recalled the incident as follows.
"Are you still going to go in there and get your film?"
Well, Dan, I don't know. I'd better, because if I turn away this time, then the next time I'm liable to turn away and it won't be easier, if you know what I mean. I know what I am, and I know what I'm not. I know that I can get scared like anyone else, and there's no need trying to bluff yourself. I've been through the mill.
Well, Roy, I don't know if it's worth it. This time, we just might as well pass it up.
I don't know if that's common sense, if we're getting smarter, if we're getting scared.
Well, I don't know either, but if I think right, maybe we're getting scared. We better go in there.
Yeah, I guess you're right, Roy would explain. Well, we went in and the nips cleared out. They said, man, it's the Ku Klux Klan. Oh, man. And I said, excuse me, gentlemen. And we went in.
Don't ever say gentlemen to them.
Look, Dan, I'm going to say gentlemen to them just to bug them so that they know I'm not afraid of them.
Roy would pick up the film, pay for it, and when they left, a group of 8 or so black men began following them. As they got closer to Roy's home, there was now around 14 following them. Roy was armed, pulled his gun, and pretended he was going to fire into the crowd, and they scattered. Roy and Dan would run back to the house. When they got there, Dan was irate. He screamed, "I ran from them! I ran from them! This is impossible!" Dan would grab one of Roy's rifles, loaded a magazine, and grabbed a second magazine, screaming furiously, "I'm going to kill them! I'm going out to kill them!" Roy would talk Dan down, explaining it would be murder if he did that. They would all go down for it, and it would do irreparable damage to the Klan. Dan would finally put the rifle down, but he would keep saying, "We ran," over and over. Dan would cool down and talk with Roy and his girlfriend Regina. After meeting with Phillips and telling his girlfriend he was going into exile, he would go back to Frankhouser's extremely erratic. He was pacing back and forth saying, "I'm ruined. I'm finished. I've got to end it all. I'm going to go down and blow up the House Committee. I'm going to blow up the New York Times." Trying to calm him down, they would ask what was going on. He'd tell them about the meeting with Phillips. He'd even say he was impressed with how deep Phillips was able to dig. Dan wouldn't tell them the truth about Phillips knowing he was Jewish. Instead, he made up a story about Phillips finding out that he was a, quote, anti-Christian Odinist, and it was going to be used to smear the Klan. After slightly calming down, Dan became erratic once again. Now he was saying he's going to kill the president. He asked Roy to give him grenades and weapons. He'd continue saying he would kill anyone Roy wanted dead. Just give him the names and he would do it. This would freak Roy out. He'd try to calm him down once again. Roy would recall the conversation.
All right, listen, Dan. You've got to stop talking this way. Let's cut this violent talk out. We'll become nihilists if we keep talking like this. Violence and violence and violence begets violence. We've got to think in terms of political action.
No, Roy, this has nothing to do with the military or anything. This has nothing to do with it. This is a matter of leaving the stage at the right time. That's all there is to it.
No, you're wrong.
Well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe tomorrow the paper won't say anything and I'll be clean. You know, man, I want to live.
Dan would tap on his head.
I'm going to have to put a hole through it.
Dan would calm down and they would go get some food and walk around and talk before returning home. Dan had fully calmed down and finally got some sleep. He would set his alarm for 8 a.m. Dan woke up immediately and went to the newsstand. He'd buy a copy of the New York Times and there was nothing. No story about him. There was nothing published. They thought maybe the story was canceled. Roy said they had a, quote, wonderful breakfast. Nothing in the paper. Tremendous. I bought that reporter out. Everything was going good, but that night it started to set in again. The New York Times wasn't bought out. It wasn't intimidated. They weren't scared. And he started to panic. They had a small Klan meeting. Roy would invite Dan to go out to eat. The conversation went as follows.
Roy, I'm not going to go unless you give me a gun.
Well, Dan, I don't like the idea of giving you a gun unless you promise to stop this talk.
It's for my own protection. You remember those niggers the other week?
Roy would give Dan a .32 caliber pistol before they went out to eat at the Riverside restaurant. On the walk back home, Dan started again saying,
If it's in the paper tomorrow, it's just got to be done. You tell me what you want me to do. I'll do anything you want.
Roy, by this time, had picked up Dan was lying about the anti-Christian Odinist story. He'd reply,
There's nothing I want you to do. What is it, man? I don't even care if you're Jewish.
But Dan wouldn't even react to Roy saying this. So he began suspecting it was something else. Maybe Dan was gay, or he had some other bad criminal record. He was baffled. They'd get home and Dan, once again, tried to convince Roy to keep all the guns nearby. Roy would tell him all the guns would remain locked up except for the 32 that he had let Dan carry. It would be in the bedroom with him and Regina. Dan would be up early again and rush to the newsstand. And there it was. Dan's deepest, tightly guarded secret was there for the world to see for 10 cents. Dan would buy the paper and walk back to Roy's house. One of the men, Rotella, would ask him, "What's in the paper?" Dan replied, "I haven't had a chance to look at it." Rotella would recall,
I was in the same room walking after him when he looked down at the page and said, "Oh my God, those are the exact words he said." And I said, "What's the matter?" And he said, "The New York Times says I'm of Jewish origin or something of that sort." I said, "That's not important. We can talk about it." He said, "No, never." And he started to run up the stairs. I'm pretty tall and I'm a lot bigger, even though he's heavier. I held his arm. He pushed away from me and ran up the stairs. I ran up the stairs after him, and he was almost 3/4 of the stairs ahead of me. And he went up there and demanded the gun.
Dan would kick the door into Roy and Regina's bedroom, saying, "It's got to be done. Where's the gun? This is it, Roy. I've got to kill myself." Dan screamed, "Where in the hell have you taken all the guns?" Roy looked around the room, making sure the guns were locked up. He'd reply,
Look, I've locked up the guns and you're not going to get the guns, so lay off me and stop.
Roy, so help me God, I'll get that gun one way or the other. It's gotta be done, Roy. And I don't care how I do it.
The two would trade words. Dan would swing on Roy with no intention of hitting him, just to get him to move out of the way. Believing everything was locked up, Roy, Rotella, and Regina watched from the outside of the doorway as Dan began to kick and punch the gun case in an attempt to get the rifle out, but to no avail. Dan would continue screaming and yelling when he noticed the .32 pistol Roy had let him carry the day before. It was on top of the bureau. Dan would grab the gun and told everyone to not move. He held the pistol to his chest, and Dan would say,
Roy, long live the white race. God bless you so long, Gina. I've got nothing to live for. Long live the white race.
He fired a shot through his chest. He didn't fall. Roy, Regina, and Rotella stood there, terrified. They thought he had missed, before Dan says,
This will do it!
Lifting the pistol, killing him. Dan lied there dead, while sirens echoed through the neighborhood. The coroner pronounced Dan Burros dead at 11:48 a.m., Sunday, October 31st, 1965. Dan's body was taken to the St. Joseph's Hospital, where the deputy coroner ruled Dan's death as suicide at 2:35 on November 1st. All the witnesses in the house would pass a gunshot residue test, and the police were satisfied that their stories matched and there was no foul play. The chief pathologist of St. Joseph's Hospital would say the first shot Dan fired into his chest was fatal. There was enough blood circulating for Dan to say his last words before firing the second shot that finished it faster. Mr. and Mrs. Burros would arrive in Reading, Pennsylvania to identify the body. They would be taken by Detective Paul J. Goldberg. The drive was silent apart from Mrs. Burros weeping and repeated cries of,
He was a good boy. He never got in trouble.
Frankhouser repeatedly called the police station asking to see Mr. and Mrs. Burros so he can give his condolences, but the messages never got through. So he'd go up there on his own in an effort to speak with them. He would say,
I walked up to the station and they were there. They were bent over. She was on the bench. He was holding his head. I could see the resemblance to Dan to some degree. She had a hat on and looked very haggard, very, very tired and fatigued. I walked right up to them and I said, Mrs. Burros, for God's sake, I'm terribly sorry about this. And Mr. Burros, what can I do? I didn't know what to do. What could I do? Bring him back to life? I'm no Christ or anything else. So I said, I don't know what I can do to help, and we talked and she started crying right away.
Dan's body would be cremated and buried in Reading, Pennsylvania, in an unmarked grave. Mr. and Mrs. Burros didn't want any desecration of their son's final resting place. On November 7th, the Klan rally in Rising Sun, Maryland would hold a special ceremony for Dan Burros, with a cross burning in honor of their fallen brother. Many Klansmen would speak about Dan's passing and how much they liked and respected him. Despite him being Jewish, it didn't matter. He was one of them. After hearing of Dan Burros' passing, George Lincoln Rockwell would hold a press conference and answer any of the questions the media had about him. He would say that if Dan was honest about his Jewish ancestry, he wouldn't have kicked him out. He would still have been allowed in the party. He would tell the press that they were suspicious that Dan was Jewish, and he would go on to praise Dan and also reveal some disturbing behavior as well.
This is last August, by Dan Burros as editor of the paper, in which he comes out strongly for the American Nazi Party. Here is Major Cale here listed as a hero of the white race, third man of the American Nazi Party, and of course all the way through here he advocates the American Nazi Party. This is the thing that I think that is going to be of interest. And also this magazine here, of which he was the editor and publisher, I have reproduced at the top of this paper here his editorial on killing and murder. And this is, of course, one of the things that we cross swords on here at the party. Why don't you go ahead and ask the questions, and then if they don't cover what I want to cover, well, I'll go into it later. Burros killed himself, and there's a chance for a good smear here. If a Nazi has to kill himself and turn out to be a Jew in order to get publicity, things have gotten to be a pretty bad point here.
What are your personal feelings about the suicide of Dan Burros?
Well, I think Mr. Burros came to the inevitable conclusion of a life of lies. A man who starts out to be in as radical an organization as this, and the Ku Klux Klan must be able to stand the light of public attention. And he must be prepared that when he is exposed as living a life, a completely opposite life of a lie, he's bound to have an explosion. That's what happened. I think that had he come simply to me in the beginning and told me the situation, I'm sure it could have been worked out. I would have had none the less respect for him because he was born Jewish, providing he realized what most of the Jews are doing and deplored it. But his mistake, in my opinion, was trying to pretend that he wasn't what he was.
You would still have been willing to have him in your organization had you known he was a Jew?
Yes, sir, providing he was loyal to the American Republic, the Constitution, and the white race. And I think he was, by the way. I think he was 100% sincere about what he believed in. The place where I differed with Dan Burros was just that I believe you've got to be 100% open and tell the truth. I hide nothing from the FBI or anybody else. And I've never had to take the Fifth Amendment and never would. But Mr. Burros obviously was in an impossible position. If they called him before the House committee, I don't know what he would have done.
You differ from Hitler on that.
Yes, sir, I do. I think that Hitler was in a position much like the police in Los Angeles when the niggers rioted to the point where there was no more possibility of civil order, and they had to maintain military order. I think Hitler had to establish a form of political martial law because there were actually Bolshevik flags being raised in Germany. And we haven't got to that point here, and I hope we never do. Are we finished on the Burros thing? Everybody was calling me yesterday and asking me 100 questions, and when I met him and so forth, I thought
Were you surprised? Had you any inkling prior to the suicide that he was Jewish?
I had no suspicion whatsoever. The only thing that was peculiar is the fact that he stole his first application when he quit here about 2.5, 3 years ago. He sneaked out of the upstairs window here and stole his application, which is a sworn and notarized statement which requires complete information on parents and so forth, and he had perjured himself, so I can see why he stole the first one. But recently, his second application, when he reapplied, disappeared from our files, which are locked and inside of a locked room, and it's very hard for me to understand how that happened. This is the only inkling I had there was something wrong.
When was he reinstated?
Matt, you know that better than I do.
Approximately February 1960. Excuse me, February 1964.
He was reinstated in February 1964, not as a stormtrooper, but as a party member.
I think Burros had some psychological problems.
Oh, I think he was entirely... All you have to do is read his editorial here and see the way he writes and how he thinks. Well, for instance, when he was here, his favorite occupation, whenever he could get away with it, was choking the party dog. We had a dog named Gas Chamber, and he used to choke the dog like mad until I'd stop him.
What was the dog's name?
Gas Chamber. And he would really take a insane glee in choking the dog, and I couldn't understand that. And later on, when we got to the subject of what we were going to do with the communist Jews, I was all for simply executing them like the Rosenbergs, and he would go into a rage, and he wanted to torture them, and he had all sorts of methods. He used to collect books on torture. And one of his greatest inventions that he considered his stroke of genius was his torture organ. What he developed was an electronic machine in which wires would be inserted in the victim, and then he was going to have a piano keyboard connected with a volume control so that he could press the pedals and push all these different things and have the guy screaming in agony as the electricity hit him in different places. Well, I don't think a normal person thinks of this sort of thing.
You considered him abnormal, did you?
I did, but he was very brilliant, and he was able to perform his duties brilliantly. I did not consider him dangerous, and as it turned out, he wasn't, except to himself. I think he was very dangerous to himself because he was...
Dog.
Well, I protected the dog. I don't know if he's gotten any dogs, but he never actually hurt our dog.
Why'd you keep him around?
Because he was extremely brilliant, and he was very helpful in his duties. He did his duties excellently. He was a national secretary. He answered letters very responsibly and very intelligently. He was able to give good interviews. He just carried out his duties well. The fact that he was slightly abnormal, I hope could be overcome in time. But as I see now what the problem was, there was no way to overcome it because it was a matter of birth, which he was ashamed to admit.